You'd open to Judges 16 as we round out our story of the last judge mentioned in this book of Judges, rescuers. This man Samson, who began with so much promise, quite literally, promises made about him before even his birth. But Samson has turned out to not really be the kind of person that we might expect God to use, is he? Much less give a great giftedness to. He is a man completely driven by his senses. Remember that chapter 14 last week was all about I saw, right? He saw, and I saw a woman, so get her for me. It was all about what he saw. He seems to have complete disregard for his consecration to God. We saw that in this kind of offhanded breaking of his vows, these Nazirite vows that were his, again, before birth. Willing to drink, which a Nazirite was not supposed to do. Willing to touch a dead body, which made him unclean and broke his vows. Yet in spite of Samson's poor choices, that's not even touching on the women, right, or the woman at this point. In spite of those poor choices, in spite of his sin, God is using Samson, but using him in a pretty unique way to try and stir a fight with the Philistines in an attempt to really preserve his own people, who were willing at this point to just assimilate into Philistine culture, assimilate into the fact that they were slaves. In fact, they tell Samson, "Don't you know the Philistines are rulers over us? What are you doing? Causing trouble for them. We should just go with the flow." So we saw Samson last week, or we really left him after he had killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. And for the first time, this promised, consecrated son prayed to God, but not to offer God thanks or praise for the victory or for his strength or for his deliverance, but really almost to shame God into giving him water to drink. Oh, you give me this great deliverance, so you're going to now let me here just die of thirst. And then afterward in verse 20 of chapter 15, we get this statement. "And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. Now again, if you've ever read through the book of Judges, or if you've followed along with us through this study, when you get that phrase, what does that indicate to you? It indicates the story of that judge is over, right? Like the next thing is that judge dies, and then we are ready to hear that Israel falls again into idolatry, and the whole pattern starts over again. But we get a curveball here. Instead of that, we get chapter 16. We get kind of this, almost what feels like an addendum to Samson's life. And it leaves us to wonder what's next. We almost hold our breath a little bit, right? I mean, you look and it's another story about Samson, and you go, "Oh my goodness, I don't know if I want another story about this character." I mean, on the one hand, we kind of dread the thought of God's judge, the judge of Israel, committing more awful behavior, bringing more shame on God. But on the other hand, we're maybe a little hopeful, right? We're like, maybe this is Samson's redemption story. Maybe there's going to be a sudden turn, and the promised beginning of deliverance will actually begin with Samson's renewed faith. But either way, we are sure of one thing, and that is whatever comes in this chapter, it's going to be spectacular, right? Because that's kind of how Samson rolls. He is spectacularly strong, demonstrates spectacular feats of strength, but he's also spectacularly bad, making spectacularly poor choices. There's no real middle ground with Samson. Whatever he does, it's going to be entertaining, right? So here we come to chapter 16, verse number 1. What will we get out of Samson? Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute, and he went into her. Here is Samson spectacularly bad. Clearly, he has learned nothing. His choices are getting worse. And as a result, his circumstances are growing more dangerous. This was not some town where the Philistines had kind of made an incursion into Israel and a neighboring town of Samson's. No, this was Gaza. Gaza was a capital city of the Philistine nation. He ventured deep into enemy territory and spent the night, part of the night, with a prostitute. Again, he sees a woman. This time he doesn't even bother to marry her. He's simply trying to fulfill this addiction that he has for sexual pleasure. This is really, in some ways, at least to this point, the worst we've seen an Israelite judge, isn't it? Sleeping with a prostitute deep in the heart of enemy territory. It is dangerous. It is foolish for him to make such choices. He almost seems to be spiraling out of control, doesn't he? He's growing more reckless and more dangerous. Verse number 2 says, the Gazites were told, Samson has come here. So they surrounded the place and set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. They kept quiet all night, saying, let us wait till the light of the morning, then we will kill him. Does this sound familiar? Well, doesn't this kind of sound like how addictions or obsessions work with us? Now, with time and enough fuel, their power grows, their attractiveness to us grows. And as their power grows over us, our behavior grows more reckless. And really for two reasons, I think. We get more reckless because we tend to feel more desperate to satisfy that craving. So as our desperation grows, we're willing to take more risks. But not only that, the more risks we take and tend to get away with it, the more comfortable we feel, right? Either in the fact that we can hide it effectively from everyone else, or we just keep escaping the danger, we kind of get away with it. And that only feeds the strength of the obsession more, doesn't it? Here for Samson, escaping this obsession of his is going to require an amazing amount of strength, an amazing demonstration of power to dislodge him from the trouble he's put himself in as a result of following these passions. Verse number 3, look at this feat. But Samson lay till midnight, and at midnight he arose, and he took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the two posts and pulled them up, bar and all. And he put them on his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that is in the front of Hebron. We just think about this for a second, okay? Because here is perhaps the most spectacular feat of strength we have seen Samson perform yet in these stories. City gates were no small things, okay? I have no idea how much this would have weighed, but it's a city gate, okay? We're not talking about the gate to our picket fences in front of our house. But let's be real honest and just understand that Gaza to Hebron was about 40 miles through very hilly country. Most of us aren't making that trek in a tour bus, right? Much less with anything to carry in our own 2 feet. Yet he picks up a city gate with the posts that buried that gate and secured it to the earth, and he carried it 40 miles and sets it on top of a hill. It's pretty spectacular, isn't it? It's pretty amazing. Yet, even with this spectacular demonstration of power, there's no deliverance of God's people, is there? There really is no great victory. There doesn't seem to be any indication of a beginning of the deliverance that God had promised. Just a man captured by his own obsessions, finding another way out of the danger that he put himself in. Do you see the problem that Samson's facing? It's really, honestly, a problem that we all face. I mean, to some degree, we all understand obsessions and addictions. We might not be in the same vein, but we kind of get those things. But the problem here that with Samson that begins to come to the surface is a little bit more than just an obsession. It's an obsession that he seems to continually be able to get away with. He experiences success in spite of his obsessions. But success becomes its own problem, doesn't it? Temptation comes with success. Temptation to take the blessings that we are experiencing from God and treat them as if they are our right. To treat them as if they really, truly just belong to us. And to assume that we can always expect that blessing regardless of what we do or where we go. We just tend to believe that God will always be there to bail us out of our bad times. We tend to use his gifts as a reason to forget him until we feel like we're cornered and absolutely need him. It's the danger of success. In this way, folks, I think we just pause for just a second and understand that Samson truly is Israel's judge. I mean, consider the parallels. I think the author here is setting Samson up as kind of a mirror for Israel to look at and see themselves. I mean, think about it. Here is a man who was called by God out of obscurity, right? He was consecrated to God. He was greatly gifted and blessed by God. Yet he is also a man who runs to other loves in spite of this love that God has shown him. And yet, always expects that Yahweh is going to be there. Always expects that there will be blessing. Well, this is Israel to a T to this point, isn't it? Willing to wander off and serve other gods, yet always expecting that when they really need him, God is going to be there to bail them out. Samson is a reflection of all of those things. This helps to explain to us why the author would give us this story in the first place. Why add this addendum to the story of Samson? And I think in part is so that Israel and we can see just how much we are like Samson. We now can begin to see how sin and grace functioned on two completely opposed bases. This is a quote from a book entitled Judges for You, by the way. In grace, on the one hand, God takes our weakness and failures and uses them for us. But in sin, we take his gifts and strengths and use them against him. Now listen, it doesn't mean that success is a bad thing, right? But it does mean that we better beware of our success. We better be on guard, because we will very easily trick ourselves into thinking that we are the strong ones, and that's the problem. When we are blessed and when we feel as if we are the deserved ones, we are the strong ones, we tend to not need God quite so much, do we? This is part of the reason why in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul says, therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. When you think you are strong, you are in danger. When you experience success, you are vulnerable. We're really good at turning the gifts of God into a means of destroying ourselves. Kind of paint a picture of this in a political way, can't we? And I kind of feel like I got to apologize for all the political applications recently, but let's face it, it's kind of on our minds, isn't it? Right? But let's just put this in a political perspective for a second. Because if our candidate wins the presidency, we feel stronger somehow, don't we? We have a voice. We have someone who's on our side. But maybe it is the case that in our strength, we quickly forget God. And we begin to put our trust in political power and influence. I was listening to an interview with a couple of Christian scholars from England, and the question that was posed to them is, what do you see as the difference, or some of the differences between English, British Christianity, evangelicalism, versus American evangelicalism? And one of the things that they mentioned was the political influence of American Christianity, American evangelicalism. He's like, in England, nobody cares what the Christians think. There is no political force in English society. That's not the case here, is it? We're kind of used to being able to kind of throw our weight around and have some political influence. The danger in that is that when we think we have some success, we can grow very comfortable in our display of our own strength. And then we begin to put our trust in things like judges and laws and Congress and president. And we are vulnerable. And I think if this election has shown us anything, it has shown us how easily we drift away from dependence on the Lord. I think this is also part of the reason why in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus makes this shocking statement to his disciples that it's easier for a camel to squeeze through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. I mean, that just blew the doors off of his disciples. They're like, what? How can that be? If rich people can't get into heaven, then who can? The reality is that for the rich, for the successful, it's really easy to trust your own power, to believe that what you have is yours and gotten by your own ability, your own power. Samson thought that he could get himself out of any situation by his great strength. And that's really the root of the temptation for us, isn't it? We tend to take credit for our wisdom, our smarts, our ingenuity. We think that we can use the gift that God has given us out of his own grace whenever and however we please. There was a Puritan pastor who was hitting on this same idea, and he wrote this: outward gains are ordinarily attended with inward losses. The more we gain externally in power or blessing, the more we tend to lose internally. So maybe the question for us to ponder is there a present or past success that has become for you a reason to forget God? Or maybe put a slightly different way, is there a strength that you possess that tempts you to believe that you are self-sufficient, that lessens your need for a sovereign and gracious God? The story continues in verse number 4. It says, after this, so we're not done yet, right? After this, he loved the woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. I mean, there's no teaching this guy, is there? He's as dull as he is strong. It's also interesting to note here that the word Delilah, the name Delilah, sounds like night. And if you read through the first 3 verses, the word night is repeated over and over and over again. And here, night is going to fall on Samson. His story is going to come to a close at the hands of this woman. Samson's a pretty big deal, though. Okay, in case you wonder what's been going on for the last 20 years, we don't get any record of what happened between the time of the little jawbone incident and the time of the picking up the gates and causing the city municipality to have to put out some funds to replace that thing. We don't know much of what he did in the 20 years in between, but we can kind of guess, right? Probably had a lot to do with Philistine women, Samson's vengeful attitude, just other displays of strength against the Philistines. And the reason that we say that is because in verse number 5, the lords of the Philistines come to Gaza and they meet up with Delilah. Now, this sounds familiar because if you go back to chapter 14, what did Samson do? He found a Philistine woman, and the Philistine men of the town came to that woman and they coerced her against Samson, right? So again, here's Samson not learning anything from the past, chooses this woman. The lords of the Philistines come to her and they say, seduce him and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him, and we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. Most people believe that the lords of the Philistines would have been 5 men because there were 5 major cities in Philistia. So if you consider one lord for each city, one governor over each city, that's 5. That's 5,500 pieces of silver. If you just compare that real quickly, and I don't know what the comparison from gold to silver back in those days would be, but just consider that compared to how much Gideon got after leading his victory over the Midianites. It's almost 3 times the weight in gold that Gideon got. Again, I don't know what the conversion rate is, but 3 times sounds like an awful lot. And what Gideon received, that was a king's ransom. These people are telling Delilah that if you give us Samson, if you figure out the key to his strength, you're going to be set for life. Not only that, but you're going to be a hero. You will be the one to finally bring down the once thought invincible menace to our state. And so begins what is a painfully obvious plot to discover the source of Samson's strength. Have you read this story before? Have you ever read this story before? You get through about 3 of these attempts from Delilah and you're going, what is wrong with this guy? Right? Let me just read one of them. Verse number 6. This is the first attempt. So Delilah says to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies and how you might be bound that one could subdue you. That doesn't sound fishy at all, right? Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings, just happened to have those laying around, that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now she had men lying in ambush in an inner chamber, and she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the bowstrings as a thread of flax snaps when it touches the fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. All right, this is why I say this is a painfully obvious game that she's playing with him here. And it wasn't the fact necessarily that she asked him where his strength comes from. Okay, he's with her. There's a good relationship here. There's trust. There's secrets between. But come on, you hiding a couple of guys? You actually try it? Just to see what's going to happen? And then maybe one of the most shocking lines in the entire Samson story is in verse number 10. Then Delilah said to Samson, I'm sorry, what? Because why is he still here to have this conversation in the first place? She just tried to ambush you, man. I don't understand how this does not say, and so Samson caved in the heads of the men who were hiding in the room, and he picked up the foot of a turtle dove and Hulk smashed the rest of the town. Because that's what he does. Because they were plowing with his heifer. The last time they did that, he destroyed their economy. Right? Why would he do this? Why would he still be here? Why is he still having this conversation? And by the way, it's going to happen 4 times. I think there's 2 reasons. Number 1, Samson is clearly overconfident in his own ability. This is the theme that keeps reoccurring. He is not trusting the Lord. He is trusting in his own ability. So not only does he not feel threatened by the danger, he almost seems to be seeking out the danger, doesn't he? Why else would you travel to the capital city of the Philistines to satisfy your obsessions? Second reason, he's hooked. He's absolutely hooked. How do we know that? Okay. For one, we read the rest of the story, right? We know where his obsessions lie. But here's the thing. This ruse is going to happen 4 more times, but it's not until Delilah says, how can you say, I love you, when your heart is not with me? That's when he breaks. Why? Because I think what that is a threat to the relationship, isn't it? You don't love me. So we might as well end this thing. That's what we think is coming, right? Guys, if your wife turns to you at any point and says, I don't think you love me, that's not a good sign for the status of the relationship, right? Things are going pretty bad. And so out of fear of the breaking of the relationship, Samson caves. Now listen, before all you romantic types out there swoon over Samson's dedication to his love, let's consider just how healthy this relationship really was, right? Because he is clearly using her, right? So we can't trust his love for her. He's using her for his own gratification, for her beauty, for her, maybe even her admiration, right? Which that can have a profound effect on a man, by the way. So we clearly cannot trust his love for her. But she is clearly using him for her own personal advancement as well, right? She's got a lot of power and prestige and money at stake here, and she's clearly willing to choose that over him. She's going to get rich. They're both only interested in what they can get out of the relationship, not what they can give. And folks, unfortunately, this kind of relationship is the normal for most people. There's this reality where it's really almost impossible for us to consistently love and to give out of love without demanding something in return. Because the reality is, deep down inside, we all need something, right? I mean, deep down inside, innately, we know we have a craving for meaning and belonging and acceptance. We have insecurities, and we look for something to fill those needs and to secure our insecurities. And so naturally, where do we turn? We turn to the people we love. It makes the most sense. It is the most likely place for us to find those answers. But the reality is, if you've ever tried this, how does that tend to work for your relationship? I'll tell you how it tends to work for mine. When I turn and I begin to put that kind of pressure on my relationship, the relationship gets strained. Because I start demanding things that I feel like I need. See, my focus shifts very subtly to myself. I'm insecure, right? I have needs. And I need you to meet those needs for me. And we do this with our spouses and with our kids and with our parents and with our pastors. And we just look for anyone that might be able to provide those securities for us. And man, Samson was looking, wasn't he? Samson could only find this meaning and purpose in his love relationships. And maybe it's because that was the only thing that made him feel accepted and needed and appreciated. Maybe that's us this morning. Folks, you know the good news out of this is that there is a God who makes promises to his people. And you know, one of those promises is, at my right hand, there are pleasures forevermore. In other words, I have everything you need. Do you need security? Peace? Comfort? Strength? Meaning? God is the unending supply of all that is good and right for his creation. You know, one of the things, if you want to just kind of like, am I putting too much in my relationships? Ask yourself this question, all right? Please don't elbow anyone sitting next to you, okay? But how do you handle criticism from the people that you love? Because the way we handle criticism from the people that we love could be a pretty decent indicator of whether or not I'm asking too much, or whether or not my focus is more on getting than giving. Interesting homework assignment for you, right? Well, Samson gives up his secret, proving once again that he does not value his consecration to God. And he didn't leave, even after he told her exactly what the answer is. He sticks around, I think assuming that it just isn't going to matter. He finally says, hey, if you shave my head, my strength is going to leave. I don't think he thinks it matters. I've already had wine, I've broken that vow, I've already touched a dead body, I broke that vow, and yet the blessing is still here. See, he possessed it. It's mine. You can shave my head, the strength is still going to be there. I don't think he had any anticipation whatsoever this was actually going to work. In verse number 18, when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up again, for he has told me all his heart. See, she knew, right? She knew she got to him. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her, and they brought the money in their hands. She made him sleep on her knees, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times and shake myself free. And then perhaps the saddest sentence in the entire story, but he did not know that the Lord had left him. I mean, certainly he knew he didn't have any hair, right? It hadn't been shaved since the day he was born. You're going to notice when that's missing. But yet he fully expected that everything would be the same. He thought it was his. Paul warns us of this in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7. He says, what do you have that you have not received? If you then received it, why do you boast as if you did not receive it? Everything you have is a good gift from God himself. Why are you pretending like it's yours? Samson thought that he was strong until God left him, and he discovered, really for the first time in this book, his own weakness. Verse number 21, the Philistines seized him and they gouged out his eyes, which is a bit ironic, isn't it? The man who was ruled by his eyes is now made sightless. And they brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles, and he ground at the mill in prison. And then verse number 22. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Why is that? Isn't this an interesting statement? You know, one of the things I love about reading these stories is that you come to it with a fresh perspective and you ask curious questions and you go, why is that there? Because that's what hair does, right? Why would he feel the need to tell us that Samson's hair began to grow? At least for most of us, okay? We're not picking on people this morning, but for the majority of us, if you shave your head, it's eventually going to grow back, right? Why state the obvious? And I want to just tuck in here this reality. But the thing is, we don't really know the reason that God chose this instance to leave Samson. Okay? Could it be that it was the final straw? Like, okay, you've been testing and testing and testing. You know, you broke your other vows. Now this one, that's the straw that broke the camel's back. I'm done. Could it be the hair itself, right? Like it was, so when we look back at Numbers chapter 6, in the Nazirite vow, if you recall, when the vow was over, the Nazirite would go to the tabernacle and the priest was to shave his head, right? That was the sign that the vow was done. So could it be that it's the hair? They shaved his head, the vow is over, and so God leaves him. Could it be that it's simply that here Samson very clearly chooses Delilah over God himself? Or could it be some combination of these things? The reality is we don't know the exact reason. But here's what we do know. The hair of Samson's head began to grow, which means the Philistines didn't bother to cut it. Why not? Because they thought that shaving his head ended the vow, and they were correct, and that growing it back wouldn't matter. Or they obviously had to think that. Why would they think that? You see, they thought the vow was the key to God's blessing of Samson. So if that's the case, then once the vow is broken, the strength is over. We don't have to worry about that anymore. And that's how their gods operated. It was kind of like a magical thing, right? With magic, what do? With magic, you follow the precise instructions. You don't deviate from it. You got to practice it, and you got to do it exactly as it is supposed to be done. And if you do, then you get the result, right? That's how their gods operated. If we do everything just right, then God's grace is on us. But if we don't, then we're done, right? But see, they know nothing of the unconditional faithfulness of our God. The God that is faithful even when we are not. The God who promised that Samson would be a Nazirite to the Lord until the day of his death. That God is not limited by a man who would despise every part of that vow. This is a God of grace, not a God who is manipulated by spells or enchantments or sacrifices, but a God who keeps his promises. With this obvious little note about hair doing what hair does, is not meant to make us think that Samson's strength was in his hair, but that the Philistines thought his strength was gone for good. It's meant to make us think that the Philistines don't know what we know, that God is not limited by the failures of his servants. In verse number 23, we come to what I think is really the point of his entire story. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god and to rejoice. And they said, "Our God has given Samson our enemy into our hands." Verse number 24, and when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, "Our God has given our enemy into our hands." So they said, "Bring out Samson, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us." And when the men's hearts were merry, they said, "Call Samson that he may entertain us." And now we see what's really going on, right? Dagon comes front and center. Here is the God of the Philistines, and what it is meant to tell us is that's been the conflict all along. The conflict really isn't about Philistia and Israel. It's not about Samson and the leaders of the Philistines. It's about God and Dagon. Who is worthy to be followed? Who is truly strong and powerful? The sad thing is that such spectacular failure of God's servants brings shame to God's name, right? Here they are praising Dagon for the capture of Samson. Man, may we never forget whose name we bear, right? Verse number 25, so they called Samson out of the prison and he entertained them. What a low point. They made him stand between the pillars, and Samson said to the young man who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them." Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson entertained. And then for only the second time in Samson's entire story, we find him praying. But this time, I would submit his prayer is different than the first time. Look at verse number 28. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, "O Lord God, please remember me. And please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Now listen, a lot of people look at this prayer, and I admit I've been one of them who look at this prayer and go, man, Samson is still only concerned about his own eyes and revenge, right? But there is something different about this prayer. Look at how he refers to God. He calls him literally Adonai Yahweh. Adonai is the sovereign one, the one who is the ultimate authority. Here's a guy, this is why this is significant, because here's a guy who has been chasing women of Dagon his entire life. Now recognizing that it is Yahweh, the Lord, the God of Israel, who is the sovereign one. That is a massive theological implication that we should not miss. And he refers to him as Yahweh. Extremely significant. Why? Because Yahweh is the covenant name of God. It is the name that would have reminded Israel that God chose them to have a relationship with him. My God. He says, remember me. Man, this is a humble cry of a repentant individual. This is a humble cry of someone who realizes suddenly their own weakness and that they don't deserve remembrance. And then he says, strengthen me. And man, for the first time, finally, Samson recognizes his own dependence on God's grace. Rather than presuming on that grace and assuming that it was his all along, he pleads to God for help. What do we see? We see Samson finally acting out of faith rather than out of his own senses. Which helps us make sense of Hebrews 11, doesn't it? Hebrews 11 says Samson acted out of faith. And through all these stories, we're going, when? Where? I think it's here. Verse number 34 of Hebrews 11, the author says, they, referring back to Samson and the other men that he mentioned, the other men and women, they were made strong out of weakness. Here is Samson at his weakest. This was the correction that was needed. This was the sin of Samson. His utter disregard for God. And his own assumption that his giftedness was his. He relied on himself. Verse number 29, Samson grasped the two middle pillars on which the house rested. And like, if this is the first time you're reading this, you're kind of going, what's going to happen, right? Like, will God give him his strength back? Will he listen to this wayward servant? And it says he leaned his weight against them. His right hand, and I love, this author is so good at this. There are times of great drama where he just slows down the narrative, right? Here's how he just slows it down. He grasped the middle pillars on which the house rested. He leaned his weight against them. His right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. And you're like, get to it, man. What happened? And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed during his life. Then his brothers and all his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. He had judged Israel 20 years. Samson's greatest victory came in his death. His highest moment came at the point when he was weakest. The sad part is that it came at the end. He didn't get it sooner. But you know what, folks? This reminds us of another death, doesn't it? Another death that would bring great victory. And once again, these judges, as imperfect and limited by sin as they are, were pictures of the one true deliverer that we all really need. The parallels are there, right? This deliverer that was still to come. He would also come not with a show of power, but in weakness. He too would be bound and mocked and tortured. He too would be made entertainment for his tormentors, and he too would die with his arms outstretched. But here's where the difference lies. Jesus would not die as a result of his own poor choices, but rather it would be our sins placed on him that would take him to his death. And his death would not be limited to beginning the process of our rescue. It would be the death blow to Satan himself. It would be the finishing stroke, the removal of the sting of death, the defanging of Satan himself. It would render Satan helpless when it comes to accusing God's people. There is nothing left for him. But folks, there is great victory. Bought by the precious blood of Christ. Offered to all who would, in their own weakness, trust him. Let's pray. Father.